Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to this Zoom meeting of some very, very old friends of mine. We've known each other over 50 years. We initially met when we were all beginning in the same year in 1967 at Yale College, where we were parts of that first class that had a majority of public school kids like ourselves.
Second class.
Once the prep school majority. And we sort of kept track, and our paths have crossed many times over the years. So I'd like you each to go around and say something about who you are, what you've been doing, and then we can begin our discussion. So Dale, how would you like to begin?
Okay, I'm a retiree. I live in Manhattan. I was in SDS at Yale with Richard and Jerry, I guess, and Robert, I don't think you were per se. And of course, that prepared me for a career on Wall Street, where among other things, I was the corporate tax attorney in charge of, among other bankruptcies, Lehman Brothers, Enron, and Donald J. Trump, who in fact was bankrupt. I am reading philosophy, economics, and history since retirement. Right now, I'm doing a Yale-related program on the Prince, which seems apropos, and just finished one on Aristotle and rhetoric. And I got married July 16th. There's my ring. Okay. Jerry, your turn.
My turn? Okay. So I'm from the Midwest, from Milwaukee. And so coming to Yale was a big deal for me because I left home, far away from home. I started off thinking I was going to study biochemistry, but I quickly, I was very influenced by the events of that time. There were riots in Milwaukee. I was tear gassed the summer before I came to Yale, so I was the outer world was very disturbing. I really hadn't discovered much of the inner world yet, and I pretty much stayed focused on the outer world for a long time. And I graduated, went to Germany for a year to learn German, came back, studied philosophy at the New School, was able to get a master's, but then I kind of ran out of steam and ended up teaching mathematics in New York City high schools for 34 years. But at the same time, with Richard's encouragement, I began to train as a psychoanalyst, for which I am forever indebted to him. And I am now a full-fledged psychoanalyst and have transitioned from a high school teacher to a psychoanalyst, which I'm doing. I don't have a full-time practice, but I have a good practice, and I teach at the institute where I trained as well. So you could say I discovered the inner world, and that's pretty much where my focus has been for a long time. But I'm very happy to participate in this, and I've been following Richard for a long time, and I'm very impressed by what he's been doing.
Robert.
My name is Robert Sarason. I grew up in Syracuse. I went to Yale for a year and a half. I actually was in SDS right in the beginning. I was also signed the We Won't Go pledge in terms of Vietnam. I actually did find in the beginning stage of SDS a difficulty where I thought that they considered students sort of as an oppressed class. maybe people don't have that, but I distinctly remember a leaflet saying that students is niggers, and I thought that was totally inappropriate. And I didn't, that phase of SDS where people were going into factories, etc. I wasn't part of that. I had left before. I left, I'd worked as an offshore oil rig. I worked as a longshoreman. I worked in a foundry, but then I later went to Charlotte, North Carolina, and completed a 4-year apprenticeship in printing at the Charlotte Observer. It had nothing to do with radical politics. It just had something to do with me getting a job and finding it, the apprenticeship, very worthwhile. After I completed my apprenticeship, I was offered a vice presidency of the local, which had a grand total of probably 300 members. And I declined and promptly returned to Yale. And after Yale, I went to Northeastern Law School, which is a progressive law school with people going into progressive causes. My first job out of law school was with the Industrial Union Department of the AFL-CIO, which was based in Atlanta, and worked with Southern industrial unions. And after that, I went to the Service Employees International Union, where I worked basically in terms of organizing. The most notable form of organizing was a campaign called Justice for Janitors, which went all over the country and basically bypassed the traditional election routes and engaged in tactics outside of buildings and putting on pressure, corporate pressure, so that the companies would sign union contracts, and the workers, the janitors, worked for contractors, but ultimately the real power is a power analysis with the building owners. So we were successful in that. I came home to my home in Syracuse, New York, to look after aging parents. And also I ended up marrying a girl, now a woman, who I'd met probably 60 years ago in elementary school. Married, I inherited 2 kids, now 4 grandkids, and I've raised money for Planned Parenthood for 12 years. I'm now currently retired, and I basically do politics, whether it's on protest or whether electoral politics. And I do quite a bit of electoral politics as well as being retired. And I've been a friend of Richard for a long time. And it's great to see Dale, because I was his freshman year roommate, but I haven't seen him for a long time.
I'll just say this about our cross paths. I grew up in Queens, then moved out to a suburb, Roslyn, and Dale was living in Roslyn. So we actually knew each other since elementary school. And as long as my parents were living in Roslyn, I would be returning there several times a year after I left, more or less, to go to college, and never really returned to live in that area until right before I came to Georgia in 1982. I lived for 3 years in Manhattan, doing teaching at various places. I would encounter Dale and Jerry while I was a graduate student at Yale, because I go down to Manhattan to sit in classes of Ken Lee Dove, who had been our common teachers in philosophy at Yale, and he was then teaching in the graduate faculty of the New School. So I'd run into them as well. Before I went back to Yale as a graduate student, I went to Germany and studied in Heidelberg. And Jerry that year was living in Berlin. And I used to go to Berlin several times during that year and visit him. And he had some friends in East Berlin. Back in those days, you could hop on the S-Bahn and you could get a 24-hour visa. And he had an interesting group of dissidents who one could go over there and stay with. And it was a very interesting experience to sort of see the state of East Germany at that time, and meeting in particular with these various dissidents. I remember one striking incident where they were having one of these World Youth Festivals, which basically involved delegations from communist parties around the world and associated youth organizations. And I remember seeing Angela Davis give a talk in a huge park, speaking about how she saw the future here on display in East Germany. And I must say the crowd around me, who was very curious in what I thought I was, had complete contempt for what she had to say and what she, in a sense, represented. And then Robert, he came back to Yale after his experiences, and by that time I was back in graduate school. And then when I finally got a job in Athens, Georgia in '82, and my wife-to-be came down and married me in the spring of that year, Robert was in Atlanta. And for a number of years, we would see you while you were heavily involved in union matters. And then, well, you moved away, but we've encountered one another since then over the years. And when I ran 2 years ago, of course, I contacted all of you when I ran for the US House of Representatives, seeking your support, which you gave from afar, and again in this run. And, you know, I thought we could perhaps discuss where we are in this fateful year. I think all of you have things to say, about what can be done. Dale, why don't you begin, since I know that you have to leave a little bit early?
Well, I thought we were maybe going to be concentrating on economic issues. And one of the things I thought I could add is a very different perspective, for example, from what Jerry or Robert might offer, or you, Richard, which is, what does Wall Street think about guaranteed jobs? Richard came up, I had organized a fundraiser together with Barry Scheck, the head of the Innocence Project at Cordoza Law School. And we had a sizable contingent of largely Yaleys and Roslinites.
That was 2 years ago, by the way, in my campaign for US House of Representatives.
Right. And I think Richard probably spent more in airfare and hotels than we actually raised. It was not a great success. And that was actually rather surprising. And I think the reason I recount it is that I talked with some of my friends after, like, hey, how come you're not donating? And I said, oh God, the guy's way out on the fringe. I mean, guaranteed jobs, let's get real. And about 2 weeks after that event, and not more really, I don't think, Kirsten Gillibrand, who I've supported for Senate races originally, although not recently, came out in favor of a kind of job guarantee program for Americans. And she's what one would call mainstream, I mean, left, but not very. And, so the idea, and she's married to a guy, she's worth a couple $100 million, or her husband is, because he runs a hedge fund. And what I think her move showed was a variation on Richard's theme that's already been running around for several years on Wall Street, which is what they call helicopter money. And it's a form of guaranteed income. And a lot of the theorists on the economic side among the Wall Street economists are very much Keynesians, and they're very concerned that how do you get people to be able to buy things, and how do you motivate people to create things if there aren't people to buy things? And if people don't have jobs, well, where are they going to get the money? Well, just drop it on them is the thought. Every time we've been in a big crisis recently, including now, and certainly during the Lehman crisis, people kind of get to the point where the Wall Street people are about, well, this is a game and there are rules to it. And if something's broken or it's not working well, you always try to figure out ways to patch together. And, Robert, being a lawyer as well, knows that a good lawyer can explain to you why a donkey is a duck or vice versa. And they'll take apart pieces of things and put them back together in order to get the objective that they're trying to attain. And I actually think that we're going to see more of this. I mean, it's very much Karl Marx from the Grundrisse, with labor being increasingly excluded from the creation of surplus value, and to the extent that it is involved, its cheap source is going to be, for a while still, China and other parts of Asia. And so how do you get Hillary's famous deplorables to stabilize and have an economic base? Initially, a lot of the thinking here, you might say, well, why isn't this just a recooking of welfare? And in some extent it is, but this is a much more broadly based strategy that's being toyed with. And the concept of just printing and distributing money has just gotten a very lively boost by the first bipartisan, I might add, congressional program to spend $3 trillion, of which not all of it's been spent. And indeed, there are questions about where to spend it and how to spend it. And even the second program, which is somewhat stalled, although I think the Republicans were willing to go $750 billion, is stalled only or primarily because the Republicans don't want to see money flowing into the coffers of governments that are ruled by Democrats in America, be it New York State, New York City, California, Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. But the kind of fear of inflation that was, on the tip of the tongue of everybody on Wall Street a few years ago, not a word about it, even though you've just created $3 trillion. And in part, it's because it's recognizing that if you have an absence of a large portion of your purchasing public out there, putting money to give them the power to purchase is not going to be inflationary. And indeed, we've not suffered inflation because you're replacing lost purchasing power. So it's interesting that this concept is gaining some steam in the circles where you might least expect it. So I just want to put that on the table.
Well, are you speaking about the concept of universal basic income?
Well, it could be that. Another, that's one form. The criteria are the things that people are arguing about. Who would you give the money to, and why would you give it, and for how long? And or is there just going to be a base guaranteed income for all citizens? And the question also then becomes, who do you let into the party? None of that stuff has been addressed with any political oomph behind it.
I think you mentioned the deplorables, or those who are, let's say,
Trump
anxious about their economic situation, and
right.
willing to be drawn to Trump, who is not promising universal basic income,
Nope.
a job, actually. And despite the ravages of automation, which indeed have reduced industrial production and agriculture as well to tiny fractions of what they had been, there remain plenty of robot-proof employments that are operating and that are going to be the focus of human activity. And in this connection, I found it almost excruciating to listen to the debates when Trump was sort of attacking Biden for all of these various programs that Trump claimed are going to lead to job losses, such as if he were to get rid of fracking, or if he was to indeed, in some respect, transition beyond fossil fuels, or do anything having to do with protect the environment. Well, indeed, you can, of course, as is always raised by opponents. You can always raise the prospect of unemployment whenever you do anything that requires entrepreneurs to make added expenditures. But if you had the job guarantee, all of those things would be moot, since whoever could no longer find work in the fossil fuel industry or fracking would be offered occupation, and occupations that are not those that are replaced by machines, but something else. And UBI, on the other hand, provides this two-tier society where you have those who just subsist on the universal basic income, which is pretty basic, as it has to be if people are going to contain any incentive to continue working. And if those who work are going to produce enough wealth to support everyone else. And then you have the other half who have UBI plus income. And I think that's the catch. If you have the job guarantee plus equivalent replacement income for those who can't work, then we're all on the same relative floor to begin with. And it's much less expensive. And it involves that added dignity of working and contributing to society. Now, I don't know if that appeals to many in Wall Street. I mean, but I think you can see both how it works as guaranteeing consumer demand, which obviously is a worry of both business and Keynesian economists. It also acts as a buffer against inflation, because when you give everyone who can work jobs in a depression or a recession, you give the buying power that resists deflationary pressures. And then when business comes roaring back, you reduce the amount of expenditures in the federal job program, which reduces inflationary pressures. So it works as a kind of stabilizer.
Right. Now, I mean, one of the things that's striking in this crisis is how different countries in Europe have different programs. And so, for example, Germany currently already has a kind of unemployment income process, which when a crisis like this hit, you didn't need a special spending program to pump money into the pockets of the unemployed and of the employers, although there is, for the employers, less support. And indeed, a lot of the EU rules about getting the state out of the economy have been suspended consciously during the crisis. But the amounts, like Germany just announced 10,000 euros per month, and Macron's doing a similar thing for small businesses, in addition to the income that's supporting some of the employees that they may have laid off. But definitely viewed over there as a crisis measure. Although the same people, that sit around the banks in Germany are familiar with all what's being said elsewhere about alternative approaches. It's just that they're living already in a different environment than we are.
I mean, I think everywhere, though, even in countries like Germany that have, let's say, obviously accessible healthcare for everyone, higher education and technical training is available to everyone, much better unemployment benefits and the like. There aren't guaranteed jobs, and in many social democratic countries, there is this anxiety. And Germany, of course, has this growing neo-Nazi movement. Who are the people being attracted to it, and what is the reason? And I wonder whether the absence of job protection, not just unemployment benefits, but to be able to retain employment, is the key. And I know, Jerry, I don't know what you think about this. Some people have pointed out how, the scourge of unemployment as something that weighs upon, let's say, the very psychology of people and adds stress, anxiety, etc. We can end unemployment if we take political action. I don't know what you think, Jerry, about if one can think of psychological ramifications to all of this kind of economic insecurity we've imposed on people by failing to have a social bill of rights that was enforced.
Well, I think you've answered the question that you've asked. I mean, there's no question that if people are not if they don't have a career, I think that's where I I guess I have some question, which is, the whole issue of maybe to distinguish between a job and a career, where a career, I guess, would be something that a person has chosen or found or somehow something which is essential to their identity and their sense of fulfillment, their sense of doing what is meaningful. And I think meaningful means something more than just contributing to society, but something that somehow resonates with their where they come from and who they are. I mean, I think that's some of the question I have a little bit about the guaranteed job is well, I mean, what kind of job is it going to be? That's a question I want to ask you.
Yeah. I mean, to some degree, we sort of have a model based upon what happened during the time of the New Deal, although then we had a much smaller population, a much poorer country. It was in the worst economic crisis at the time, but admittedly, they did a certain amount of employments that involved manual labor on various kinds of public works, but they also involved all sorts of other employments, including, I mean, think of all the federal theater projects, the federal writers project, putting artists and so forth to work. Of course, there are all sorts of human services. I mean, I think the idea in all of these cases, we're doing something that should not be competing with the private sector, because that would just make jobs redundant, which you don't want to do, especially when there's a problem of overproduction and idle capacity. You want to be doing things that are needed but are not being provided by the market. And this, of course, could be organized at both, not just the federal level, but state and a local level. So it could also involve a certain kind of community input in determining what kind of projects are needed. So there's a kind of meaningful aspect to it. And the idea would be you would make use of what are the training and talents of everyone and try to fit them in as best one could, and see how it operated.
I mean, again, when I hear this idea of putting people to work, there's a real distinction between some kind of government authority, which is providing jobs for people,
yeah,
and people finding jobs for themselves, and how I mean, clearly we're in a time now. I mean, I have artists as patients who are. I have a musician as a patient. There's no, he hasn't been able. His regular income is gone, and he's I've had to lower his fee considerably, and he's having to figure out what to do with himself. And he is, I mean, slowly he is trying to, put things together so that, he has to be changed. He has to make some changes in his life.
Yeah.
He's not going to be able to go back to what he was doing.
Yeah.
And, that's, in some sense, one of the things I talk about is that mental health, one of the keys to mental health is flexibility. And it's adaptability, to be able to change when you have to change. And this is a struggle for people.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's an example.
Yeah.
I try to think of him as being put to work, and I'm not sure how he would deal with that. I just when you said that, I wonder, like, how.
Well, you have to think of it it would still not be something imposed upon people. It's not like we're going to be operating in the way they did in the old Soviet Union and communist nations, where vagrancy or being unemployed was a crime, in effect. And you pretty much had to take an occupation that in some respect was determined by the apparatus. Here you'd go to instead of going to the Labor Department to file for unemployment insurance, you'd go and see what jobs are available. With the
Richard,
there will be something for you. At the end of the choice. Yeah, Robert.
in the discussion in terms of jobs, I mean, there's I know you're proposing a higher basic wage in your platform, but because it's related to the fact that many people are working 2 and 3 jobs.
Sure.
To survive.
Yeah.
And it's been a traditional demand of the labor movement for a shorter work week.
Yeah.
and greater benefits. And one of the things that Western Europe is clearly ahead of the United States is in terms of less work, in terms of the work week, and more vacation, more sick leave, et cetera. So that by cutting down on hours and having greater, that will also create more opportunities, and so that would help alleviate the problem.
Yeah. And the problem, by the way, is not going to be alleviated simply by offering everyone a job at $20 an hour. You have to also ensure that medical services are available, ultimately without copays, deductibles, premiums, and let's say financed by fair taxation. Likewise, have access to education at all levels without, as they do in Europe, without tuition and with stipends. As well as, I think, also having a child allowance, because any fixed wage rate does not take into account how many dependents you have. So when you put all these things together, then the need to have more than one job is removed, and it's not as if you have to work a 40-hour week. It would be possible, if we are sufficiently productive, to begin pecking away at that standard, which we've never had in this country, right? There is no maximum work week. You get 1.5 overtime if you fit into certain job categories, but Americans are working more than 40 hours, at least many. You're sort of smiling, Dale?
Well, on Wall Street, if you don't work a 60-hour week, you're not working.
Even after you make partner.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Partner when I made a partner in my firm, the head of the firm, who looked like everybody's image of a Wall Street lawyer, or some people called him Franconia Notch because of his profile. He said, I don't want you, to the new partners in this initiation meeting, I don't want you to necessarily think of this as a lifetime employment. And I went, well, what the F do you think I was working for? But anyway.
I mean, it seems there are these professions in this country. I don't know how it compares with other places, but we have these very lucrative professions. Medicine is another, where it's almost like a hazing, where very, very long hours are imposed. If you think of interns, they're forced to work ridiculous hours. It's almost like joining a fraternity.
Right.
Some people will try to justify it and say, okay, you need all this added experience, but maybe you could get the experience with a shorter work week over a more extended period of time. And of course, it's not clear that you're in optimal shape to deliver services if you're strung out, for 36 hours or whatever.
Well, I think that latter point is the principal reason why, as I understand it, internships have become somewhat more
Your audio is cutting out. Dale, your audio.
Oh, sorry.
Try again.
So I had, years ago, I was dating a woman who was an intern. Yeah. She was a girlfriend of Juliet's, and she was a neurologist.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about them, of course, there's very little they can do. So you come into the emergency room, it's like it's too late. But even so, there were stressful decisions. There's this something Jerry may be familiar with this. The doctors call it Drano, which allows you to deblock whatever clogged arteries you might have in your brain. but in the process of dislodging the blood clots from the arteries, they sometimes pull along with them the walls of the artery and create holes, and then you bleed into the brain and you're worse off. And so making that decision is exactly the kind of thing, you're in the middle of a 36-hour shift, and then you're supposed to make this life and death decision, and you don't have a lot of experience yet.
Yeah.
So that's not so much.
Let me ask Jerry and Robert a question related to employments you've had, and that is, I'm suggesting besides having a much more automatic procedure for having unionization at all workplaces with multiple employees, that there ought to be something akin to what is called co-determination in Europe, where the boards of directors of enterprises, both private and public, would have half the seats filled by employees elected by their peers. And I think, for example, of a situation in the public schools in New York, where I think it probably is the same situation as it is here in Georgia. Namely, you have school boards that are administering schools. They're fairly decentralized, but they do not have any employees on them. In Georgia, you're not allowed to run for the school board if you're an employee of any sort of the school system. And of course, we've seen in New York all of these struggles over community control over schools way back in the 60s and 70s that pitted teachers' unions against communities, particularly minority communities. And I was wondering what you think of what it would be like if we had that kind of reform, where employees had a real role in the governance of where they work. And you too, Robert.
Well, I had that experience. I mean,
yeah.
I was teaching in a large public high school in New York City, where I experienced the importance of leadership, namely the principal, and the principal who was admired and left the school after being there for a long time. He was replaced by someone who was not as good, who then left the school, and then he was replaced by someone who had no experience at all. And the kids literally rioted in the school and spontaneously marched on the Board of Education. And at that point, I said, I better get out of the school because I felt my life was in danger. At that time, which was was 1994, I remember New York City had started 50 small high schools on the, somehow they figured this out, that the large high schools were no longer effective for the populations that they were serving. And 50 small high schools started, each of which I joined one. When I went to my first meeting, I felt like I had died and gone to heaven, because we were making the decisions. We were exempt from Regents' requirements.
Yeah.
We could do what we wanted to do,
yeah.
And the first part of it that I died only came true later, when I learned how much work it took to run a school and be a teacher at the same time. But I experienced it, and I saw how being involved in decisions that had to do with my employment, not wages, but just curricula, things like that, was enormously exciting, and I'll never forget it. And that's evolved in the city now, where I'm not quite sure what the situation was, and it's very, very dependent on leadership. But workers being involved in their conditions of their employment and things like that, I experienced it, and I'm all in favor of it.
What do you think, Robert, from your experience at places where you were organizing? How could you see?
Well, first, I have to go back to education. Dale remembers this from law school, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, where the argument was raised in terms of equal protection, in terms of, well, why don't poor kids get funded as well as rich kids? And because our school system is based basically on property tax, which is poor kids get screwed, versus wealthier kids, which is, I think, a key component which is never discussed in education at all. It's sort of out of the debate, but it has to come back, that debate. And in terms of participation, one is the question of how much a difference it would make in terms of power, where market forces determine so much of what's to be produced and how it's to be produced, et cetera, et cetera. But within those confines, worker participation and worker respect are an important part. I mean, it's sort of people sort of laugh sometimes about, well, they're fighting for dignity and et cetera, but actually it's true. And for those businesses who treat people right, union people always argue, well, they still need a union in terms of workers having power, but where workers do participate and have more control, not only of the wages, hours, and working conditions, but how everything is done, it is a more meaningful experience. So, and overall, it's obviously a positive.
I mean, have you found it coming up in discussion in your years in the labor movement as something that the labor movement could itself put on its agenda?
Yeah, I think it actually it does emerge in terms of the idea of being on a workers looking the bosses, in terms of looking at them in the eyeballs and having control that much of the job. So in terms of the language of co-determination, I think that could emerge eventually, and I don't think it's that different from the basic demand of having control of the workplace. Yeah. I mean, it's a concept of economic democracy, and it's whether you consider the word socialism in terms of economic democracy or anything else, it's always a part of the agenda.
I wanted to bring up something you mentioned about school financing, and to some degree it goes back to Jerry, but I wanted to direct it at Dale, since you're going to be leaving relatively soon. To deal with this issue that the way we don't have any real commitment to education in our federal constitution, it's left to the states. And I think only 10% of funding of public education is provided by the federal government. States provide the rest, and more than half is provided by property taxes. And obviously that involves inequities, since it depends upon how wealthy a neighborhood is, how much money they'll have available. There have been efforts in some states to spread it around, but nonetheless, it remains a factor. So I was suggesting that we shift the funding of public schools to the federal government entirely.
So I didn't hear you, Rich.
I was proposing that we shift the financing of public education to the federal government entirely. Take it out of state hands. The administration could still be done if one wanted in a state or local manner, but the funding would be provided in an equitable way. Some countries in Europe give extra money to communities that are struggling with various problems that require extra attention for students. The Netherlands does that. But in looking at education, I did a little bit of research for this book of mine, Democracy Unchained, and it seemed that there were only two factors that had any noticeable impact on educational performance. One was how much teachers were paid, which had effects through every year of a student's career. And the other was class size, which had the greatest impact in lower grades. All the other stuff had no appreciable effect that could be determined. And My thoughts are in terms of taxation, that we should try to put as much of the public funding of all of the services that we need to exercise our freedoms, healthcare, education, what might be required to provide a sufficient supply of housing, all the various kinds of paid leaves and public child and elder care and the like, on a federal tax system that would be as progressive as possible, meaning we put the burden on highly graduated taxes, particularly income and wealth, and think about getting rid of all deductions, have everything as simple as possible, and have the burden of public taxation go on the top 10% with particular attention to the top 1%. Since the top 1% is almost 40% of our national wealth, the top 10% now has approaching 80%. And that would be a way of having fair taxation, fair in the sense that you're funding public investments for the sake of enhancing all of our freedoms, and you're doing it in a way where it's funded primarily by those whose opportunities will be least impacted by what they have to pay. Now, I thought I'd ask the tax expert among us, tax law expert among us, what do you think about this? Or what do you see as the way to go with regard to remaking our tax system?
Well, I mean, these are old questions, and as to education in particular, I know 50 opponents to that strategy. They're called the governors. They want more money from the Fed always, but they would not want to surrender whatever authority they currently have.
Yeah.
Out on Shelter Island, where I have been living for the last 6 months, the budget is local. It is funded largely through property tax, and there is a significant state input to the budget that is vital to operating the school. And the school is having surprisingly smooth absorption of an increase in the student body of 25%. That is, the Islanders, who are largely working class with incomes in 50 grand, except for the self-employed plumbers, electricians who do a bit better. And the annual budget is analyzed very closely by the locals, item by item. But the total enrollment in the school system on the island is 200. And with people from Manhattan fleeing to the island and deciding when they had to decide, which was August, no later than, they opted into the Shelter Island school system. And so now the enrollment has gone up by 50 students. But amazingly, because they haven't hired anybody additional, it's more like working harder with what you've got. They've obviously had to increase classroom size. Fortunately, 50 divided by 12 isn't that big a deal if they're evenly spread. And I haven't seen the breakdown to know. So they basically kind of absorbed it. But if you said, well, you don't have to worry about that because this will come through other monies and their national standards, you might get some response from the people that was favorable because you've taken financial burden off their back. The problem has always been that the moment you get money from somebody, they put strings on it, be it private, benefactors or public ones. And so you would rapidly find that the politics at the state level have already played a role at the local level in terms of what goes on in the school. If you upped it to the national level, well, you're going to have even more issues. And as to reform of the tax system overall and how you would do that, flat taxes have had repeated incarnations. Eliminating deductions, period. It depends what you mean by that, because if I'm a solo entrepreneur running a store and I own it, I might have an LLC that I package it in to protect me from people suing me for everything when they slip on a banana peel. But apart from that, I basically run it as my own business, which a lot of small entrepreneurs do. The question is, what do you mean by deductions? Is the cost of the goods you sell a deduction? Generally, for accounting purposes, actually, it's kind of not, because it is a deduction de facto. You just say your income is net of cost of goods sold. But you put in the cost of goods sold, the shelves you sell them on, the cooling system that you put all of your refrigerated stuff in, the repair bills for that, the electricity for the store, blah, blah, blah. And, these are things that it's in the detail that the fighting takes place. The reason the Internal Revenue Code is the single largest body of codified law in the world. The code and the regulations thereunder is larger than the Code Civil in France. It's because it's about people's money, and they will fight for every penny. So, you've got to be able to have a consensus, which I don't think we've ever reached at the national level, about how you do this. And I don't see that being imminent. I do see there being a big debate coming up now when Biden wins, which he will on Tuesday. There will be a big debate over how do we raise the monies to pay for a catastrophe like this? Where does it all come from? And, it's the only warning I would give on that is if it just goes to, if you tax people that have over 100 million, you'll still get pounded because they'll use their money to, think of what Bloomberg did. He said he was going to pay off all the debts of every convicted felon in Florida, which is tens of millions of dollars. In fact, I think over 100 million. He could afford it. And he did that so as to be able to beef up the voter base in Florida. But you got people on the other side that are going to spend that kind of money for, let's say, less progressive views of what society should be like.
Now, I know that there's some constitutional issues. It might require a constitutional amendment to have a wealth tax, just as we needed a constitutional amendment to have income tax. But some people raise the objection to wealth taxation that it's either going to lead to a capital flight or it's very hard to administer. Do you think there are insoluble problems with wealth taxation? Or do you think
it depends how you do it. But, if you do, for example, Ron Lauder bought a Klimt painting and paid $115 million for it about 7-8 years ago. Now, nobody had paid anything like that for that kind of a painting before. So all the Klimts lying around in different collections in New York, their value went up immensely. I looked on Zillow for my house on Shelter Island, just by virtue of the fact that my next door neighbor was asking for his house and put it on the market. He asked twice as much as I know it was worth. The listed value from Zillow of my house went up by a lot. And then when it was obvious that he couldn't sell it, and then he dropped the price that he was asking by 25%, then the value of my house fell. So, thinly traded property, like real estate, hard to tell. And that's where a lot of people have their assets. And if you're really rich, you put it into all kinds of esoteric things. And for example, museums. Everybody wants to have a big municipal budget for an art museum, but you know what? That just basically inflates the value of art for those people that are looking for a multi-generational escape from the woes of the economy. You get rich enough, you buy a lot of important art, then you do things like Ron Lauder. He opened a museum, basically of Austrian and certain German expressionist art of the 20th century. And I remember when it first opened, you looked around at the walls, what was on there. Most of the stuff was, if it was lucky, 100,000, a couple 100,000. Museum's been open for 10 years. He bought the Klimt for 115 million. Now every painting that he has temporarily lent to the museum has skyrocketed in value. They're all, I guess my point is multiple. It's that the rich are very creative. B, apart from a publicly traded market like the stock market, it's very hard to get to realistic assessments of value. There are 10 guys on Wall Street thinking for every one guy in the government as to how to get around, these attacks. So I've always been highly skeptical that you're going to succeed with a fell swoop. But more importantly, just watch the political landscape down there. I mean, none of this, if you have a 51-52 Senate majority for the Democrats and you build somewhat the House majority, it's not clear that among those Democrats that you'll get a majority to do this kind of tax. And if you do, I already know what, of course, the campaign slogan in 2 years is going to be of the Republican Party. In every state that a senator voted for that kind of tax, it'll be tax and spend Democrats, throw them out. So like Obama, you'll have 2 years in which to get everything done.
Well, I'm proposing
Or not done.
that
Done. Yes.
yeah, I was proposing that we put the entire tax burden on the top 10% and have a complete cessation of federal taxes on the bottom 90%.
Well, that I think is politically an attractive way to go.
Yeah.
But then you do have to worry as to what happens at the top end and what they might do.
Yeah.
You would think that kind of program would have been offered numerous times. It's not. I would get these data from the IRS every year, and they show there's one graph in particular that I always like to follow. It's on the bottom line is your income from right to left, right the poorest, left the richest.
Yeah.
And then percentage, and then they have a couple of variations. One is the vertical graph, this tax is paid. The other is the vertical graph, wealth owned. And it's like those games that sand thing that you had when we were kids, where you could move the sand and shift it all one way or another. The bottom 50% makes no money, pays no taxes. Like the bottom 50% of the population pays less than 5% of all the taxes, income taxes.
You're talking about income tax. Of course, they pay sales taxes and all sorts of other taxes.
They pay sales tax, and although less, because they're not buying yachts where you pay a big sales tax, they're buying food where you don't.
But in terms of their income, it could be a greater amount.
Yes, but nonetheless, I'm saying the entire bottom 50% on the income tax is 5%. Sure. And then when you get to the left-hand side of the graph, the top 10%, are paying, 40%, 50% or more of the tax, and the top 1% is paying, 80% of that. So yes, the money is, like Willie Sutton, go to where the money is. Yeah. But it's the political party that's actually proposed that has never been found. And so I think it does have a plausibility to it, because you basically are saying to a huge percentage of the population, it's the other guy. I discovered as I was earning more money every year that whenever they talked about the super rich, that was the category a step or two above me. Yeah, and tax those guys. Absolutely. So I think that's a normal human reaction. And I think you would find a certain amount of receptivity if you said that's where the money's going to come from. Yeah. But, we're talking about lots of money. Don't forget. Yeah. Talking about lots of money.
Yeah. But of course, it's there. The wealth tax, since wealth is about 5 or 6 times income, both nationally and probably even much more among people in general, at the higher end, the wealth tax rate would be much lower than an income tax rate, and of course reap equivalent benefits. But of course the simplification might. I mean, when I think about legislation, the role of a legislator, we all know that in the way it operates now, any significant bill is this gigantic tome, could be thousands of pages long. Obamacare, any tax legislation, etc. It hasn't been read by the people who vote on it in Congress. It hasn't been written by the people who vote on it in Congress. It's basically been written by lobbyists. And I remember asking, you may remember Eddie Grossman, who was a member of our high school class, who had a career in Washington as a lawyer assisting Congress in drafting legislation. So I asked him, why couldn't the legislation be as simple as possible? Leave the administrative details to be handled by the executive branch, and thereby have bills that actually could be written by and read by legislators and even the public. And his answer was that, well, the legislators are too suspicious, that the executive branch is too partisan to be trusted with carrying out the law. So you've got to fill out all the details.
Well, I mean, Eddie wrote, by the way, for Robert and Jerry's benefit, Eddie Grossman wrote not only Hillary's health bill, but he wrote all the competing health bills. The Times did a 2-page, the old New York Times back in the 90s, did a 2-page, it started on page 1 with an inch or two, and then 2 full pages inside about Eddie Grossman. This was really funny because Eddie would walk around high school with a clipboard, and he ran one of the political parties in the high school. I ran on that ticket. His mother was an operative in the New York State Democratic Party, a fairly big deal. And Eddie was the most low-key guy you can imagine. And it's because he understood that it all happens behind the curtains. And he was great at it. But I think, Robert, you might have had this kind of law school course. We had freshman year, it was, I forget the name, but it was taught by Norman Dorson, who was then the head of the New York City, New York Civil Liberties Union. And one of the big themes of the course was general legislation, which says, anything you do that's bad is illegal, versus if you speed 5 miles over the speed limit, the penalty is this. If you speed 6 miles, it's that. So, putting a finger in every hole versus broad approaches. Part of the problem is what you want from laws is predictability, i.e. that when you act whether what you're doing is going to have specific consequence. Certainly for criminal law, you want that. You don't want people going, gee, it's okay if I shoot 1 bullet, but if I shoot 2, it's not so good. And the same with domestic law. That's why I say the tax code is so detailed, because everybody wants to know, how much am I supposed to give you at the end of the year? Because they want to know what they can spend during the year. And, and that's why you have huge body of case law around the taxes. People fight over every penny. And so it's both the executive, as Eddie said to you, the executive branch, but it's also the judicial branch, because you'll end up having people saying, no, it said gray, this is black. And somebody else is going to say, no, it's white. People fight over everything. And if you don't believe that, just watch the next 2 weeks when, Donald starts his lawsuit parade when he loses badly.
What do you see as what we're facing this
Well,
election?
by the way, I do have to drop in 3 minutes.
Okay.
It's a health,
Yeah, sure.
a health thing for.
Yeah.
But I think keep your eye on North Carolina and Florida. If they break Democrat, it's going to be a landslide. And, obviously, some hope, he'll fight these, but Texas, smaller chance, admittedly, but Texas could break the right way. I think Ohio's going to stay Republican. I think Pennsylvania's going to go Democrat. I think Wisconsin's going to go Democrat. I think Michigan's going to go Democrat. I think Iowa's going to go Democrat. So I think it could very easily, steamroll. I'm surprised by the decorum of the media in not publishing, exit polls from people that have voted early. I don't know whether they've pledged to do it. I don't recall that. But we have, I think it's pushing 90 million votes already cast.
Yesterday, I was down in a town called Covington, about 15 minutes away from where we are. And I went into the office of the Democratic Party. They're one of the more active Democratic parties, actually helping candidates like myself and getting material out and the like. And the person I spoke to was on the election board. because the election board will have one member from the Democratic Party, one from the Republican, and some neutral observer. And they're beginning to look over the mail-in ballots. Now, I am in this crazy special election, the so-called jungle election, where to begin with, there were 21 candidates of all parties and third parties, et cetera, on the ballot. I happen to be at the very bottom of the list, right
Oops.
below the Democratic frontrunner, Raphael Warnock.
Warnock.
But what this person told me is that a substantial number of ballots are having all of the Democratic candidates among those 21, there are 8 of us, they'll all be filled in. Or on other ballots, all the Republican candidates, all 6 of them are being filled in. Meaning all of these ballots are going to be disqualified.
Wow.
Because people are thinking, well, they're sort of voting down, the down ballot, not recognizing what they're doing. And
I'll have the egg rolls and the wonton soup.
Yeah.
And excuse me, I
so
hate
that
to
means
do
it might,
this, Richard.
yeah.
I'm afraid I do have to get off.
Sure,
This
sure.
is, as I say, this
Okay.
is a health thing. And it was great to have both of you guys back on. And I hope to be hearing from you both soon.
Great. It's great to see you, Dale.
Yeah, nice to see
All
you.
right, great
Okay.
to see you, Robert.
Okay.
Take care.
Good to see you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
I took this adventure this time as well as last time, thinking that, if you look at our political system, because we have a primary system, it's possible for anyone to get into a race and use the race as a place where you can try to put forward an agenda that might not be followed by other people in the party, but could nevertheless fit within the party if you choose to work within it, and a way of trying to transform the party, get the message out to a wider group of people, maybe even win. I mean, in my race, because it was this jungle election, which would inevitably lead to a runoff, all you needed to do was get about 23% of the vote to make it to the final. Because you have primarily Republicans on the one side, Democrats on the other, and you have these small little parties that get maybe 5%. So, there seemed to be a pathway, provided I could get free media attention and maybe some support from that part of the electorate that would be close to my positions. And I found I did not get any media attention, really, to speak of. The media completely ignored, to some degree, this race in general. They focused more on the other Senate race, which is a regular Senate race with a primary. But they really would only report on the 2 Republican frontrunners who were awash with a lot of money. Kelly Loeffler was spending, who knows, maybe $35 million of her own. And then Doug Collins, this very conservative Trump apologist who was very active in the impeachment hearings. And then you had the person who the Democratic Party establishment closed behind, Warnock, who was able to spend more than $10 million on TV ads and the like. And that's what the race has been. The press has not been providing any buffer to the grip of money by reporting on the rest of us and giving us a chance to get our messages out. And then the people who I might have thought would support my policies have sort of stood on the sidelines throughout. The people who might have been drawn to Bernie or Elizabeth Warren or other groups, including labor groups, have pretty much not been willing to be of help. So I'll have to see what happens. I'm hoping to make a respectable showing after the big media darlings and establishment darlings have gotten their totals. But I don't know what you think about the strategy to be followed. Because I think both of you agree with the kind of agenda I'm putting forward in many respects. And the question is, how do we get it through?
Well, I mean, Richard, this being your second race, I'm wondering, what you've learned.
Well, in the first race, I learned something about what it was like to run at the level of a congressional district that is in a district carved out so that you have almost a supermajority of Republicans. And at the time, I felt in that race that I could become the Democratic nominee and maybe get national attention as a very different kind of nominee facing the Republican incumbent, a conservative, a former radio evangelist. And that I could get that position because in those kind of districts, there are no established Democratic figures with any political clout. And half the time, no one wants to run. You have Republicans running unopposed. Just like currently, this Republican woman who's an advocate of that conspiracy theory is running unopposed. But 2016, people wanted to run. So I did have an opponent. But you can't get enough resources in that kind of district to be able to get out to the voters, your message, the majority of the voters. And the press is not there in those areas. So I sort of learned that. I sort of learned, in a sense, how difficult it was, although I felt I had an actual chance to win the primary, which did not come true on primary day. In this race, I had certain thoughts about how a statewide race had advantages. There's no gerrymandering to contend with. So a Democrat can actually win, which is not really true in my district under the 10th district, congressional district under current conditions. And I thought there'd be a lot of free press. I also thought that people on the left side of the Democratic Party might pay attention to me. Now, none of that came through, and I really saw how the press thoroughly ignored what I consider as Democratic duty to report on the candidates and inform the electorate. And of course, it was an unusual race because it was this jungle election with no primary, which had a very low win number, but nonetheless, it was a big mountain to climb. I'm really not sure how many people in the state know about me. I raised a limited amount of money, actually less than I did in my congressional campaign, because of all the difficulty of attracting people, because they didn't know who was in the race. There were so many candidates. There was a worry about a threat of spoiling, where two Republicans might end up in the runoff, which really would never be true if the Democratic establishment fell behind one candidate who obviously would get more than 23% when the time came. I did speak wherever I could. I did do a limited amount of advertising with radio ads that are now going to be hitting the airwaves this weekend. I did put up some billboards. I did Facebook ads, but all of that is a small effort given my limited resources. And it was impossible to have a ground game that could be huge enough to have impact statewide, which would require thousands of volunteers and would require money to manage them. So it was, it's very challenging under our current electoral system. It would really require a change where there'd be public subsidies and that could ensure that all candidates are able to get their message to the voters. So all voters really were informed.
Which is interesting. Our congressional candidate, the Democrat took money from the campaign, which you're allowed to do after a certain point in the campaign, and it was just amazing how much publicity the Republican made out of that fact. So that. I mean, the law sounds nice, but in practice, doesn't work out very well.
Well, you can see, when you think about the whole electoral process and the way in which money is allowed to have such play in being the vehicle for getting any kind of contact with voters, there's the side of it that, on the one hand, the voters are not being properly informed. So even if they're able to overcome voter suppression, which is pretty rampant, they go to the polls not knowing who they're voting for, really, or what the options are, which is pretty disappointing.
I have a question. Why don't the super rich put even more money into the campaigns? That was one question I've never understood. Someone like Adelson could put I don't know, $1 billion into a campaign, couldn't a year? I mean, I
Well,
don't, you know.
I mean, he
I-
just
and
put
I-
another 157, but think of what Steyer and Bloomberg did. They put over $1 billion together.
They
into
put
the
it. They did
campaign.
put over a billion in.
In their presidential races. I think they put a total of $1.5 billion. And when I was here during my campaign at the time when the presidential race was going on, when Bloomberg began putting his hat in the ring, it was kind of astonishing to see how many Bloomberg operatives suddenly popped up when none of the other presidential campaigns had anyone on the ground in Georgia.
Right.
And when I would go out and I would attempt to be interviewed by small local papers, including African American papers, they would all be filled with Bloomberg ads. It was, I mean, he had put so much more money into the process. Of course, he showed you can't buy it all. You can get your message out to the voters, but if another candidate can also get a message out to the voters, you may not win. But if you're like me with very meager support and the press is totally ignoring you, then money can really triumph as a position to be able to do it. And then there's the other side of it. You know, think of the predicament that came up with regard to the candidate you're speaking about, namely, think of what the situations of employees in running for office. You know, I think I've told this before. I'm a state employee by law. I'm not allowed to keep my job while I campaign for statewide or federal office. I have to go on unpaid leave. You know, if you're going to be a serious candidate, you've got to take off from work in any significant race. If you're an employee, you've got 3 obstacles. You know, you have no income during the race. You have no benefits that are attached to your job. And you're likely not to have a job waiting for you at the end of the race if you lose. So how many employees can possibly afford to run for office? And if you look at who's in Congress, well, they're not employees, let alone union members. They're either independently wealthy, they're professionals who can continue making money during the race and go back to whatever they were doing, right? Businessmen, lawyers, doctors, etc. Hardly any employees. So, you know, these are aspects that make our democracy really tainted by oligarchy, you know, where wealth is really obstructing any kind of democratic empowerment.
So given that, I'll go back again to the question of what you learned. What, you know, if, you know, are there compromises you're willing to make in order to you know, move forward?
Well, look, I'm not a professional politician.
Right.
You have the people who are making compromises. They're already there.
Right.
And they're already getting major support.
Right.
And then the question is, well, of course you could try to influence them. I was hoping I could have some impact. For example, on someone like Raphael Warnock. In fact, through the manager of another candidate, we tried to approach his campaign to see if they would think about adopting a federal job guarantee. Warnock is the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church where Martin Luther King, you know, was a pastor. And the Poor People's Campaign had a federal job guarantee as its anchor. And 6 years after his death, his assassination, his widow, Coretta Scott King, launched a movement for full employment that you hear almost nothing about. It had 300 demonstrations involving 1.5 million people, and it ended up being betrayed by the Humphrey Hawkins bill, so-called full employment bill, which did not provide employment as a right. It sort of
I've never heard that.
Yeah. And then here we have him running, and he, of course, I mean, he doesn't speak about Medicare for all. He doesn't speak, of course, about a federal job guarantee or a Green New Deal. He avoids speaking about policies to a great degree. You know, he's coming off as an establishment Democrat. And the people against him who were in the limelight, like Matthew Lieberman, Joe Lieberman's son, offers hardly anything in the way of policies. You know, these were the people who were being paraded by the press. And what do they, and how do they get out to the public? Well, they have TV ads with a soundbite. So there's very little opportunity for real political discussion. And I was finally on various debates. Of course, when you have 21 candidates, you hardly have any time. The Atlanta Press Association at the end of the campaign season always has these debates that are broadcast on public TV. When you run for Congress, they're not broadcast live, they're put on their website. But I was on it live this time, but they divided up into two parts. One part had the people who got more than 3% in the polls. So you had the people who had money, and then you had the rest of us. And it was like a 45-minute debate with hardly any time to say anything. I had 45 seconds to make a closing statement. So it was really kind of pathetic as a way of making up for their failure to inform the voters about anything. So that's, I mean, admittedly, in a campaign, you do have a chance to speak to people in various circumstances. You don't often get the chance to speak to people more than once. So what do candidates do? They have their stump speech. And most stump speeches by middle of the road candidates have nothing to say in terms of policy. They're telling you about the personal history, family history of the candidate. They're wrapped up in identity politics more than anything else. Or they talk about their experience. And if they say anything about policy, they preach to the choir and don't make any argument about anything. So that's political discourse, and you're given very little time at meetings to say anything. So that's sort of the framework in which we're there. I mean, what do you see as the alternative or ways to get messages out?
Well, I mean, one thing I wonder is, you've had a career. You're a distinguished academic. You weren't a candidate, but you had, my sense, an enormous influence over a large number of people. Yes? No? You're
I don't know. I mean, I don't feel, look, I've never been part of the philosophical establishment, which is dominated by analytic philosophy and postmodernism and things of that sort. And so, although I've published everything I've written pretty much, it's not published by the kind of presses that are dominated by people from the most prestigious schools and the like. And the professional association has not really ever invited me to give any kind of talk, believe it or not. I'm active, I'm quite productive and so forth. But I don't consider myself a public intellectual where my writings have had much of an impact. I had this discussion with Noam Chomsky that we put out there. He's a public intellectual. And he writes things on topical subject matter that are widely read. He's able to continue his academic work at the same time, right? But to some degree, who is it who sees his work? It's sort of within a kind of very narrow audience of similar thinking people, or within the Society of Letters of the New York Review of Books and that sort of thing. So, I chose to try it as a candidate. I mean, otherwise you get in the trenches and you decide, okay, I'm gonna have a life in politics and work your way up from the bottom, or alternately in the union movement, right? I mean, these are options one can think about. I was more concerned with dealing with the theoretical questions I couldn't answer and trying to respond. But other options were to think, okay, I do what Robert did, enter the labor movement, spend my life doing that. Or alternately, maybe think about just getting involved in a much earlier age in electoral politics and see where it goes. Those are options. And in between my two races, I wrote a book of political policy that was intended to be more popular. But then I fell within two stools because it wasn't an academic book. So I couldn't really publish it with the people I had published with. I couldn't find an agent, which I needed to get through the front door of any reputed academic press. I really didn't have the contacts to do that. So I had to publish it. I published it, but it's had a very limited audience. I spell out things in much greater detail and more completely than I can on the campaign trail.
Right.
So it serves a purpose. It's there, and it's written in a way where it has enough of a philosophical content, I think, to be of interest to someone who would come upon it 100 years from now or more.
Do you read history? Do you read history in such a way that you think Norman Thomas had any influence on our political discourse?
Well, I mean, look, you have those figures, of the very small socialist movement in America. But of course, the New Deal, I think, was a turning point and incorporated ideas of people like Norman Thomas to some degree. And we're not
No,
over with that.
the question is whether he had an influence or whether it was just coincidental. That's my question.
You mean by putting himself out as a candidate, or?
Yeah, that Norman Thomas is an electoral official. Does that make any difference in terms of what FDR came up with, or?
Yeah. Well, you have different avenues. You can one avenue is to take the path of a Eugene Debs and a Norman Thomas and work within a third party. And sometimes third parties come to power. I mean, the Republican Party of Lincoln was a third party at one point, but managed to become dominant. But I think in the current situation, it's very, very hard for a third party other than the Republicans or Democrats to get anywhere, given our majoritarian system. And I think Bernie Sanders showed, even though he was kind of an independent, that you can have a fighting chance to work within the Democratic Party and transform it in a major way. Elizabeth Warren as well. He came close on 2 presidential runs. He didn't succeed, but he came close. And he was able to raise enough money in the campaign to be able to get his message out to a large part of the electorate. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not impossible. Of course, he already had a long career and was a known person when he did that. For someone like myself, I'm not. But I think that's an avenue to think of working within the Democratic Party and trying to push the kind of agenda, which is not alien to it. After all, FDR was the Democratic Party at its best, you might say, even though the civil rights movement had not yet come to fruition. And that tainted some aspects of the New Deal, but otherwise, it's a point of departure. Yeah.
What kind of connections have you made by by running twice? Are there people that you've met who you will continue contacts with? And I mean, the idea is that you're putting forward things that are not part of the the everyday discussion. So it's by putting these things out there, the idea is that it becomes part of a discourse that happens.
Well, I'll tell you this. I on the campaign trail, under normal circumstances, when there isn't a pandemic, when it's not when meetings are not virtual, you meet all sorts of people that I would never have met otherwise, and you speak to all sorts of audiences. My last campaign, when I was on the ground, I would speak at a lot of African American churches. I'd speak at union halls. I'd speak at veterans groups. I'd speak at all sorts of venues. And the people there would hear what I had to say. I'd also be there on the campaign trail with all the other candidates. They would hear what I'd have to say. I'd be going to a lot of county meetings of Democratic Party, which I also did this time around. They would hear what I had to say. So some people get a chance to hear it. And frankly, generally speaking, I get a positive response to what I'm presenting, because I think the policies make sense. And the arguments I'm giving, again, I think are convincing. The issue that comes up in a race like this one, to a lesser extent last time, is a question of, well, are you going to prevent the chances of a Democrat winning in Georgia? Because there were people who would bring up this issue of a spoiler effect. Of course, if they supported me and the newspapers paid attention, maybe I could be one of the people who got 23%. Maybe there could even be 2 Democrats who made it to the runoff. But that was a big argument that I would be facing. People would say, well, we need to flip Georgia blue. We need to win the Senate. And we need to just close ranks behind a kind of establishment candidate who will do that. But of course, I still think a race like mine is worthwhile to get another message out there. Hopefully get some support, which will put those who are elected on notice that there's a certain amount of support and for these kind of measures, for this, job guarantee, social rights agenda.
Right.
Let's see if it can be.
What about younger people, Rich?
Well, younger people, frankly, don't come to too many of these venues in terms of the organization of the Democratic Party, which is one place it's always easy to speak at. The other kind of venues that I was speaking about, African-American churches, under circumstances where there's no pandemic, union meetings, veterans meetings, and so forth. I mean, the young people, I think, are, despite the fact that they may now be more motivated than before, I think they've been rather alienated from the political process. Their figures for voting are remarkably low. I'm hoping that will change this time around. But I mean, the percentage of young people who are voting is very, very small compared to other ages.
They're saying it's a big difference this time.
I'm hoping so. We'll see. We'll see. Now, I did not attract droves of followers who became volunteers and the like. But I think what I have to say would resonate with many if they had a chance to hear it. That's the big challenge, getting it out there.
Was there a sizable group of Bernie people in Georgia, or was he a non-person?
Well, I'll tell you what happened. I went right before the pandemic shut everything down. I went into Atlanta to a meeting that was going to be launching Bernie's campaign in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think one could expect that if things had not been shut down, the outcome would have been similar to what it was when Hillary was running against Bernie and had basically the support of all the African-American political establishment, because almost no elected Black officials were backing Bernie. So, they eventually were turning to Biden once the message came in the Carolinas to do so. So there was a crowd there, mainly of people from so-called progressive groups and the like, who were ready to go out. But then that all collapsed. It was shut down and he withdrew. And they just stood on the sidelines with regard to this whole Senate race that I was involved in. I mean, I was interviewed by various groups. None of them ended up endorsing anyone. Unfortunately, that was the situation. I had hoped that once Bernie had pulled out, there'd be all of these people, wondering what to do next. And that they'd look at what I'm standing for, because I clearly was the one candidate who was presenting an agenda that included everything Bernie was pushing for and more.
And more.
That they would be excited. But they really didn't come across.
Have you made a connection with Bernie?
I never have been able to. People at that rank, there's no way of approaching them unless you have an in. That's even true of AOC. Now, it's impossible to make contact with these people unless and none of them really paid attention to me down here. And none of the little progressive groups were willing to help or pay attention or give an endorsement. First of all, their resources are very limited. I know from my congressional campaign, they only wanted to help candidates who they felt were very winnable. And obviously, I'm very much a long shot.
So, yeah.
Although I think, obviously right now we are in a perfect storm. It's a huge wake-up call for everyone. Now is the time where these policies could really resonate if someone was to articulate them. and put them out there. I mean, like I mentioned this when, when you see how easily Trump can batter Biden, when Biden, waffles on the issue of what's he going to do with the fossil fuel industry or having environmental regulations and the like, because Biden is not willing to come out for a federal job guarantee, he's very vulnerable. Same thing with regard to health insurance, because he's not willing to come out for Medicare for all. He's very vulnerable to all these arguments against the deficiencies of Obamacare. And the public option that Biden is offering is not going to solve all of that. He's just setting himself up to not be providing answers that could be presented so clearly and so persuasively and would make him much more formidable. But he's just not willing to go that far.
So, I mean, let's say he wins. Where do you see things going?
If he wins?
Yeah.
Well, I think we are still in a deep crisis because this pandemic is continuing. It's not going to end, frankly, until we have a vaccine that's workable and that's administered. I don't see us being able to put it to sleep, and it's going to continue to involve economic disruptions in this country, given how far we've allowed it to spread. And there's going to be a need to deal with that. And the policies that are being provided are not sufficient. And there's going to be public pressure, I think. I mean, think of the schools. Here in Athens, Georgia, the schools are operating remotely. We're kind of a hotspot, especially with the university opening. And the crazy thing is the university's open, whereas university students could handle remote learning much easier than young kids in public schools. And they're the ones who are frolicking in the bars and allowing the level of infection to be high enough to prevent the schools from safely reopening right now, because they're not testing things in a mass way or anything like that. And of course, people don't have broadband. They don't have public daycare. It's really a completely unworkable situation. And it can't keep on dragging on like this. The governments have to do things, and it's really going to be up to the federal government because the state government doesn't have the resources to provide the answers. So I think it's possible for the Biden regime, if it manages to make it into office, to be pushed to do more than it is currently prepared to do. And
how do you see that happening?
Of course, what?
How do you see that happening?
Well, I think it's going to depend upon public pressure, maybe pressure on the streets. And I think hopefully some of the people who are elected into office will push for things. I mean, there are people who support, for example, a Green New Deal, which includes a federal job guarantee. I mean, the effects of climate change are not going away. They're going to get worse and worse. And Biden has, in a way, a fairly ambitious platform, much better than Barack Obama or any Democrat before him. He's talking about 2035 as the time to achieve clean energy to a large degree. But you sort of have to add to that a guaranteed jobs for people in the fossil fuel industry. I mean, so hopefully things can be pushed in the right direction. Maybe not at once. Same thing with healthcare. I mean, Kamala Harris supported Medicare for all originally. I think that, given all the health problems and the crises and unemployment and the like, I think it's time for people to wake up to how something like Medicare for all is a plausible option. Now we'll see. I mean, obviously there'll be further elections coming down the pike 4 years from now. I don't think Biden, if he makes it, is going to be running again. I mean, we'll see who's there on the horizon, but I think if we're going to get through these crises, more has to be done than before.
Richard, well, what's the percentage of people who could vote who aren't registered to vote?
I'm really not sure. But in Georgia, you have people who've been thrown off the voting rolls. There has been growing registration. but I'm not sure. I mean, you know, think about United States voting participation. It's quite low compared to other countries, other democracies.
Right, because I was just wondering, I once heard of this thing is like it's only 25% of the people really, of the voters vote. You know,
Yeah, I mean, I think
that half the people aren't registered and only half the people registered who vote. I don't know. I just want to know if there's any truth to that.
I mean, I think it's close to that. I don't have the exact figures, but it is true that there's a significant part of the population that is not registered. And keep in mind all the people disenfranchised through either being convicts or having been convicts. That's 6.5 million people. Then, of course, you have District of Columbia, another couple million. And then you have Puerto Rico, and these, you know, we're talking about in total maybe an additional 12 million people who are not able to vote for these reasons. Obviously, we'd have a completely different electoral outcome in the last several elections if they could vote. But yeah, I mean, it's a minority of the voting age population that determines.
I mean,
small minority.
I mean, that's for me. That's always the most amazing thing. I grew up in an upper middle class home, and politics was at the dinner table. But when I went to work, and is the number of people who either thought, you know, that they're all crooked, you know, it doesn't make a difference was phenomenally high. And, you know, and for instance, among, you know, printers, you know, we're sort of not at the bottom of the economic heap, you know. There's solid tradespeople. And I mean, there was a very prevalent, at least in my group, very prevalent attitude of like, it doesn't make any difference and who cares, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, you know, because you and Jerry deal with alienation. I just want to know what Jerry's thoughts are in terms of people being divorced from the whole process.
That's not the group I deal with for the most part. I mean, I've worked in clinics, you know, as I transitioned from teaching to being a therapist, where I worked with low-income people. I mean, and the conditions that they were dealing with were so awful. You know, just, you know, drug addiction, families where, you know, there were just not enough resources. The fact that they could actually come for some mental health services was incredible. But you know, it's the real bottom, and you know, it's so frightening to me, the pandemic right now in terms of education, in terms of people who are in those conditions, because it's it just feels like these people are going to be lost. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm not sure. What was your question? I got lost by the.
But it's basically the same. I mean, it's a question in terms of people. It's just like just surviving. Sort of like politics is almost sort of like a luxury type of thing. So it's like, I mean, maybe in your practice now you're basically dealing with wealthy neurotics who politics is part of their life.
Yeah. And I think if you think of the way in which the economic situation of a large sector of the population has deteriorated since the 70s, with, you know, wages falling behind both inflation and education and healthcare and housing costs, and the nation becoming increasingly more unequal with regard to wealth and income, and the political process becoming more corrupted by money, and all of this happening under both Democratic and Republican regimes. You know, you can see on the one hand why people can feel alienated, but then there's also that pervasive, rugged individualism that infects a lot of the population, which is resisting, for example, taking proper precautions for a pandemic. speaking about these precautions involving an infringement on their personal freedom. Well, what is their personal freedom? It's kind of an enslavement to desire, their own egotistical desire. It's disempowering because they, in effect, are renouncing any engagements in solidarity with others. And it also is further disempowering because they regard the state as nothing more than something that restricts their freedom, rather than being something that is provides them a kind of freedom you can't have without engaging in self-government, which is the highest freedom of all, on which all the others depend, and which allows you to do more than any other kind of engagement.
So
But they don't see that, right?
Richard, this brings us back to academics again. Okay, you and I were both tremendously inspired by teachers and to go deeply into issues of politics and much broader things. I mean, you're going to return to academia, right?
Yeah, on January, if I don't make it.
Yeah, I mean, where my sense is you've had a tremendous impact on a group of people, right?
Well, I'll tell you this. I've been in academia for more than 4 decades, and I recounted this in a discussion with former students. I have never experienced being able to change the thinking of my colleagues, nor of the people I meet in academic conferences, by and large.
What about your students, though?
The students is a different question.
Yeah.
Because I'm in extended contact with them. And that may also be true with someone who takes the trouble to read one of the books I've written, which is a time-consuming effort where they're with me and following my thought. And that's where I can have an impact. And that's, in a sense, the sphere of my impact. Now, because I've been where I am at the University of Georgia, which is a school that doesn't have the greatest academic reputation, I have had graduate students, but they have great difficulty finding work. Some have been productive, but not as many as would have been the case if I were in a more, let's say, prestigious department, or one that was, let's say, more in tune with the philosophical establishment. So my impact in the profession is relatively limited because I haven't had that many students who've managed to be able to find jobs in academia, let alone jobs in prestigious institutions where you get much more exposure. All of these things sort of compound themselves. Now, I do have a crop of good students. I've had very good students, frankly, as good as anywhere else. But they face all of these kind of obstacles. And that has an impact upon what kind of influence.
So what are they doing?
Well, to take some of the latest crop, one person who recently wrote a dissertation for me couldn't find an academic job to begin with. We'll see what happens. He himself had been working in computers and has a kind of business that he's working in. Another one ended up going into the labor movement, actually. Others are sort of struggling to see if they can get an academic job and hanging out and seeing what will come. Others have gotten just ordinary jobs. One actually works for immigration services. It's tough to get a job in academia. It was never easy, except for the time when the public university systems were expanding in the 60s, and then everyone coming out with a PhD had multiple offers. But once that expansion stopped, it's been tough. It was tough for me. It took me 5 years to find a position. And so I've been in this position as a tenured professor, the same job, now getting close to 40 years. I look at my kids, like my daughter, who had to change jobs very frequently after being, things she worked with going out of business or downsizing or whatever else. I've had this unusually secure position because I am a tenured faculty person, although that can be under threat, as we all know.
Are you involved with the union at school?
There's a union that was set up in 2017 that I joined right when it was starting. And it was being organized by the Communication Workers of America, which has gotten into trying to organize all the employees at state university systems. They did that in Tennessee, or they're trying to do it, I should say, because all the right to work laws in the South and much of the country prohibit collective bargaining for state employees, as well as the right to strike. So that's, well, we're attempting to do that. And, you know, it's growing with people who've signed up, but it's going to be a long road ahead. Now, of course, you know, we're in a situation now where all the decisions being made as to how to deal with the pandemic are being done completely without any input by staff, including faculty. It's the administrators and the State Board of Regents that are doing all of this, just like in the public schools. It's the Board of Ed doing it. The Board of Ed does not have anyone from the staff, teaching or non-teaching staff.
Union has quite an impact in New York City.
Yeah.
It's a very strong union, though.
Yeah. Well, we're far away from that so far. But that's why I feel that there really should be mandatory union elections at any enterprise, where it'll just happen, and people who want to run to represent the employees will be up there. If you don't want to participate in the election, don't participate. You know, we don't have to sign cards in order to have an election for who our state representative will be, or our congressperson. Why need that be the case at a workplace? So in that way we move towards, I think it's Iceland that has the highest rate of unionization in the world, over 90%.
Yeah.
Whereas
Richard,
we
I think
have
if you
6%.
run again,
What's that?
if you run again, you need someone, you need a documentary filmmaker who's accompanying you.
Yeah.
There's, you know, there's different ways to get these things out.
Yeah.
And maybe if, you know, if the media is not one way, I mean, you know, the press, this is another thing.
Yeah.
You probably have people, a media school in at U of G, right?
Well, I've suggested to people if they were interested in doing something like that. Actually, a group of documentary filmmakers did film us as part of a documentary they're working on, which is focusing on Democratic candidates running in very Republican areas. And we'll see what happens. I don't think it will be a feature length, although I suggested to them they should make it a feature length, because I think otherwise these things don't get distributed. But we'll see. Well, Sujata is going to have a word.
Hi, I'm going to come here.
Okay. Sorry.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi.
So what I wanted to ask you, because Richard is talking more than asking, but I wanted to ask you what you think of how a candidate, why should somebody vote for a candidate like Richard, where there is always going to be this feeling that he can't get the vote out. He's too unusual, he's too radical. And we need to flip the seat blue. We need to go. And once we get a Democrat into office, who's the establishment candidate, then we can push him to make the changes that are necessary. I mean, I find it very, very problematic. And I think that is what is ultimately, other than the lack of money and influence and not knowing the right people and all of those things, it's this attitude that is behind the politics of white middle class people, by and large, those who are not affected by anything, who are economically well off, but who, as you were mentioning, Robert, that group of people but they have politics in their lives. By golly, they want to make a change, and they're activists, and so they are the ones who are the most conservative when it comes to supporting somebody like Richard, because they're so full of passion about flipping the state blue and getting a Democrat in. They simply do not, I mean, I really despair. I think, I don't know if it's the closing of the American mind all over again. Or what is it that people are not excited by what Richard has to say? I mean,
You can't, if if you're not pragmatic, then nothing's going to get done, right?
well, then
okay.
why should Richard stand at all? I mean, why should a candidate like Richard be there?
You what?
Why should he run for it?
Well, this kind of takes us back to the idealism of our youth, which is we didn't expect pragmatism at all, and it's you can as a philosophical position, that's one thing, but as a real life position, that's something else. If you're not, it means being realistic. That's all. Facing reality. That's, to me, that's the question. Is yes, the program is admirable, but how realistic is it? That's all.
The program is realistic because you can pay for it, but it's what is not realistic is to get people to support it.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, Robert, since you are in electoral politics, how would you answer?
Yeah, it's so much in terms of realism. It's sort of like just taking my congressional race is this woman ran against this guy who was really, really conventional. An ex-military guy, Irish family, and who basically had nothing in either the brains department or an excitement or anything. And so everyone said, you got to support him because he can flip the seat blue. Because we live in an area where the Democrats are gaining demographically. So anyway, I supported the more progressive candidate, and she won 2-1 in the primary. So now there's this race, it's razor sharp. And the other people said, see, if you had gone with this military guy, he would have had a much better chance, and, we would have, we could have won, no problem. So it's sort of like, the weighing of the practicals is what exactly it's all about. It's sort of like, when do you compromise and when don't you compromise? And, there's no easy answer, but I could tell you that if this Democrat in Georgia was in some danger of not making the primary, I would vote for him in a minute over Richard, because of the practicality of it. But if on the other hand, for people in terms of exposure to ideas, I don't know if people have done it, but I call them the kids, but politics, in terms of the people who do politics, in terms of campaigns, it's usually done by kids who are very smart and very hardworking, et cetera, et cetera. And I've told them about Richard's campaign a couple times, and I don't know if they've gone to the website or not, because they were all Bernie people, blah blah blah. And I say, well, if you want to see a really progressive platform, go see my friend who's running for Senate. So it's sort of like that makes the difference in terms of they rather than them being so comfortable with their Bernie ideas, it's sort of like there's other people who could push you the other way. So I think there's a real benefit to what Richard's doing in terms of people seeing that there are other ways of going forward. But then in terms of when it comes down to the nitty gritty, the practicality will rule the day.
There's sort of two stages to that. One is, the beginning of the race, where maybe it's not a foregone conclusion how things will turn out. And you can try to fight for the candidate whose positions you consider most attractive, even if it's a long shot. You see how it develops. And then, well, as the election draws near, then you can see who you would want to vote for. I mean, right now, there's no doubt that Warnock will make the runoff, because all you need is
So I
23%.
would vote for you, and I would vote for you in in this situation.
That's what I'm telling people. They can make a statement that maybe will prick up the ears of those who make it into the next administration. There's a sizable number of people. And I think if I were to come second to Warnock on the Democratic side of things, that could mean something, and hopefully point out that these ideas do have support. I mean, actually, polls do support the ideas more than there's been a poll on a federal job guarantee in Georgia, and more than 60% of voters support it once it's explained to them. Of course, they've never heard of it, by and large. They also support Medicare for all if it's explained to them. And I think it's also true about a Green New Deal if it's explained to them. That's now gaining majority support.
You mind if I just ask a question about the Warnock thing? I don't understand. What's going on? I haven't followed the.
I mean, basically, you have two elections for Senate in Georgia. One was a regular election, regularly scheduled, with a Republican incumbent facing candidates on the Democratic side who competed in a primary, and a guy named John Ossoff won that primary and is facing the incumbent in that race. Then there's another special election that took place because the Republican incumbent, Johnny Isakson, fell ill and resigned. And the Republican governor appointed this very wealthy woman, Kelly Loeffler, for the seat. And there's a special election now on election day to fill the remaining 2 years of Johnny Isakson's term. But there's no primary in this special election. Everyone runs, all 21 candidates. Now they're 21, one person withdrew. There are about 8 Democrats, 6 Republicans, Green Party, Libertarian Party, various other independents. And that means the winning number is only about 23%. If you get 23% the vote, you make it to the runoff.
I thought they take this. I thought they take the top 2.
Yes, but that's what the top 2 will have. They won't. The second will not have more than 23%. Just given.
So there's going to be another election. Is that it?
In January, there's going to be an election of the 2 top vote getters.
So you're shooting for to get 23?
Well, originally that's what I was shooting for, and if I could have been covered by the press and have gotten the people who were leaning in my direction, it might not have been that hard to get that. But the question is just getting exposure, which is worse when you have a pandemic, which is shut down in-person events, and then when you have 21 candidates, of which you're just one.
Yeah.
Where if you have events, forums, you hardly have any time to show yourself. So all these things are very big obstacles.
Yeah.
And so 4 candidates had money. Matt Lieberman was the first Democrat out. He raised about $1 million on his own, partly because he was the only Democrat running at that time and his father's connections. But then the Democratic establishment decided to go for Warnock. They've given him more than $10 million of TV ads. So he's far, far ahead of any other Democrat in terms of exposure. It took him a long time to get any support that was, in any way comparable to that amount of money, because he's not standing for very much, frankly. But he's gotten, he's now registering over 40%. So there's no issue of someone voting for me and having 2 Republicans in the runoff. And the support of Lieberman is collapsing. He originally was getting more than Warnock, who's getting 20% plus or whatever. And so
Republicans and Democrats are running in the same.
Exactly. Yes. So that's the catch. That's the catch.
Yeah.
And initially,
And that, yeah,
initially it was exciting to think that here would be an opportunity for Richard to actually address or debate with the Republicans.
Yeah.
But again, the way the system worked out, and when the one lonely debate did take place, he was bumped off into the minority group.
Right.
Where in the majority group, it's funny that the one of the Atlanta radio stations that discusses politics every day only covered that
NPR station.
NPR station only covered that particular debate, and in that debate only covered the top 4 people. And then Bill Nygaard, the host of the show, had the nerve to say that, well, there was no policy discussion. So I'm thinking to myself, well, if nobody's standing for anything, how can there be policy discussion? The only discussion is who's higher in the polls and who's got more money and who's this or that. The policy discussion was where, would have come with Richard if you had bothered to discuss it with him.
Now, I had been going to a weekly debate that was hosted by the Libertarian candidate. We invited all the candidates, all 21. None of the front runners ever showed up. It was just a motley crew of myself, the Green Party, a couple of African-American Republicans, another Libertarian guy, and we would debate different topics every time. Didn't get too much of an audience, needless to say. And at some point, he suggested we go on the road on an all-day kind of protest event where we would go to every major city in Georgia, which amounted to driving about 800 miles in a day, and have a press conference where we would be denouncing how the press has been ignoring us. So I went on that with them. We did that. There might be maybe one local TV station that showed up at each of these venues, not much.
Yeah.
But that was our sort of cry of anguish.
On a personal level, but
Anyway.
Psychologically, how has this been? Because I mean, I just know in terms of leading candidate, it's brutal. So I'm just thinking in terms of your campaign. I can't even. I mean, I admire you so much, and I just can't imagine how brutal it is.
It hasn't been that brutal, partly because by being so much under the radar, I haven't been the target of the kind of attacks that I could imagine being subject to if I were, more known to the entire specter of voters. I mean, I find, for example, when I do have Facebook ads that go out to much larger group of people than I'm meeting otherwise, and it also includes people all over the political spectrum, I get a fair share of pretty virulent attacks. Of course, nothing to take very personally or whatever, but I could see things being much more brutal if I had been more exposed than I am. But in terms of what I'm doing, I mean, I have to say that there are 2 sides of campaigning that I've experienced, one of which I really do not like, and one of which I find generally exhilarating. The part I find exhilarating is getting out and speaking to people. And like I say, both getting out and getting to all these different places I haven't been to, meeting people of all sorts, walks, engaging in discussion with them. That has been somewhat curtailed this time around because of the pandemic, because the number of in-person contacts has been very, very reduced since that happened in March. The other part I can't stand is calling up people for money. And unfortunately, a candidate like me, who is not a household name, is not going to raise much money by sending out emails or anything like that.
Mm.
And so I would have to do a good amount of that. What was new about it this time around is that now you have these bots appearing, where you call someone up and there's a strange bot that might sound like Hillary Clinton going on, or other people. And, I caught on after a little bit as to what was going on. In other words, people have more kinds of high-tech devices to avoid speaking to you.
Mm.
I have had some interesting conversations with a few people who I get through to on all sorts of things that have actually been quite informative. But generally speaking, having to do that is not very pleasant. But otherwise, it's not as if I found it a brutal experience. I'm through it. I've dealt with the fact that I have family members involved. And of course, family members can let everything hang out in a way in which other non-family staff would not. But nevertheless, we've made it through. And
Rich, one of the things I have to say I find very impressive is, given that you're a philosopher, how much you seem to have mastered the kind of details and facts and historical, you have a lot. It seems like you've learned a lot about reality.
Well, that's part of what I've had to do as a candidate.
Yeah.
And I did it the first time around. I deepened it by writing this book of political policy.
Right.
And I did it further this time around. I had a podcast where I
listened to it.
Had over 20, and I had to do a fair amount of research for each of them.
Yeah.
And learned a lot of that factual stuff and policy wonkish things. So, I've accumulated. Look, that's part of what you have to do if you're going to be a candidate who's standing up for things and thinking about policy.
But you seem like you did a very good job of learning that stuff. I was very impressed. Yeah. Very, very impressed.
Unfortunately, the audience of the podcast has not grown to any great degree. About 2,300 people or 2,300 listens have occurred so far, but not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but it's out there.
2,300 is a considerable number of people, Richard.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, it's something.
I mean, those people talk to other people, it's not,
yeah.
I found, Richard, which I think is most lacking in some way, and that I most want to see is debate. Okay. In all the things that you've put out, your podcasts, with Chomsky, whatever, the person from Bard, I haven't heard any debate, real exchange of ideas where, that's, I miss that, and it doesn't get me thinking. I want to be challenged. I want to think more. And without debate, there's none of that happens. I don't know what you could do about it. I think in terms of the university, are you able to engage in debate at the university? Is there, does your department encourage debate? And is it meaningful debate?
Not. Look, you have people who give papers and there'll be questions and discussions, but that's not really that much of an opportunity for debate. You do it in classes, actually, by reading and discussing different positions. And that's we have a debate, really.
Is it satisfying?
Well, of course, it depends, what figures you're looking at. But I find it satisfying in terms of teaching, right? Yeah. Because you are looking at, the whole history of philosophy consists of that.
Really. I'll tell you another thing that I find very impressive about what you've done, Richard. Probably a lot of this comes from having been a teacher and clearly having been a philosopher, is that I feel like you're someone who can think on his feet. Yeah. Okay. Which I think is extremely, that ability is so important and so, I'm very impressed by it, Rich. And
me too.
Yeah. Yeah. You're well informed. You've thought things through, and my sense is you could stand up to anyone, and you're willing to do it. Which is, how many people can you say that about?
In fact, in one of the last campaign, when we had one of these meet and greet kind of things, and Richard gave us a speech, one of our acquaintances of long-term acquaintances said, she was so impressed. She said, "Richard, you could be standing for president." And I thought to myself, really, the candidates who are up there as presidential candidates, Richard, we can take them on. I mean, he might not know the particulars as much as somebody who's been in the Senate already or in the Congress already, but as somebody who can basically know something about everything, be it foreign policy, be it domestic policy, or just general knowledge, he, I think, is far superior to so many people. So indeed, yeah. But anyway, he started too late in politics, I think. And the point is how to get him there. Because, ultimately, one can say that other candidates might be influenced and carry his ideas further. But I think having thought so much of what he is putting out and the philosophical backing of it, he's the best person to propagate his views. He's the best person to be able to persuade.
How many philosophers have run for office? Have you researched this?
Yeah.
Besides, I mean, do you have any sense of, going back whenever? How?
I think, well, very few. I ran into one last time I ran, who was running on the Green Party, somewhere in Illinois. I don't think he succeeded, obviously, but not too many. Not too many.
It's like the philosopher.
Okay.
Kid, right?
Well, look, I want to thank you for
I
participating.
want to thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Not
Rich.
sure what I will do with it or how I will edit it, but we'll see. But thanks for participating. It's there, and I'll put it somewhere where you can have access to it, where you can look at the recording if you ever want to look at it again.
Thank you very, very much. Sujata,
I'll
Richard,
think
Jerry.
about what parts of it
Likewise.
are worthy of public view.
Minus my participation.
So we'll see.
I
Okay,
think-
no.
No,
That
but-
was helpful.
But I think
Okay.
one thing parting shot I want to say is that I've always told Richard that he should have a Friday evening, happy hour with his students, or start a group, a debate. I mean, a debate group or a discussion group, which meets once a month, if not once a week, once a month. And in between the two campaigns, we had started a social action group called something or the other, where Richard was trying to use his ideas to influence local politics at the local level, which is not possible much because they don't have much money or power. But nevertheless, that group is still there. And, we are hoping that, as you brought up the need for debate, perhaps one could keep having people come in to speak at length and engage in discussion with nothing at stake except except time.
Richard, you remember our last reunion?
Bye, guys.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Our
Bye-bye.
last-
Bye-bye, Jerry.
See you around.
Bye-bye, Richard.
Okay, bye.
Remember our last
Bye,
reunion
Robert.
where there was a panel that I think Kurt Schmoke moderated, and
Yep.
Howard Dean, I think Barry Scheck,
Yep.
and the guy who was governor of, or as mayor of Bridgeport or something, was
Yep.
on it. Remember?
Yep. A little
The-
bit.
The mayor from Bridgeport was so much more alive than these other guys.
Yeah.
Because he was, he's dealing with local issues. He was, he felt like he was making a difference.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you feel like, local involvement is something that you can do or inspire other people to do, but thank you so much.
Okay.
Let's
Thanks for participating.
contact.
Okay.
Okay.
And we'll be in touch. We'll be in touch.
Likewise. Okay,
And
great.
stay safe and give my best
Okay.
to everyone.
Say hello to
Take
your
care.
kids and.
Sure.
Okay,
Okay, bye.
good. Okay, bye-bye.